Hi there everyone, welcome to another perfect pairing. Card background techniques continue to be some of the most popular tutorials online. In this tutorial, I'll share 3 of my favorite card making techniques for beautiful backgrounds. I'm sure that these card background making techniques will enhance your focal element on any of your Altenew projects. So when I think of really easy and quick ways to make beautiful backgrounds, one of the first crafty items that comes to mind is by using one of my wide selection of stencils. So the first item I wanted to showcase is the fairly old Watercolor Stripes stencil. Onto my Crafter's Essential stamping mats, I'm going to get a rough placement of where I want this stencil to go. And on here I want to try to create a light drop shadow. So once I have a rough placement of where I want this to go, I'm going to lower it slightly down and over to the right and tape down my stencil to my craft mat. I'm going to take a really light gray ink. I'll use Morning Frost from the Warm Gray family of inks. And in my small ink blending tool set, I have 2 of the sets of 4 so that I encompass all of the colors, a brown and a black. And I'll apply a barely visible layer of this ink. The majority of this is going to be covered up, so I'm not so concerned about getting this really even. However, I do want a fairly defined edge, so this is okay for me. Now, since I have enough real estate to create a rainbow array of colors on my background here, and all of the ink blending tools that coordinate with that, I'll go ahead and make this a rainbow striped background. But before I do that, I will pick up my stencil again. So I'm going to recenter my stencil on top of my card front. Alright, so now my stencil is back in the original orientation that I had planned before. And for this layer, I want intense saturation to try to cover up the gray that I have behind these exposed areas. So I'm working in Pink Pearl first, then Heartbeat, then Orange Cream, Warm Sunshine, Grass Field, Lagoon, Persian Blue, Deep Iris, and finally Pinkalicious. So you'll see I haven't put anything away yet because I'll need it for the second step. But before I do that, I'm just going to take a quick peek at what this looks like. Okay, good. So I have a nice little drop shadow underneath each of the stripes, and each layer has adequate saturation and a defined edge. So I like that. I'm going to replace the stencil. I'm going to amp up the look of this stencil and tie it with another crafty item for this card. The next stencil I'll be using on this background is the Milky Way stencil, which is a star layering stencil. These images fit within this one. And without removing the watercolor stripes stencil, I'm going to overlay the Milky Way stencil on top. Actually, I'll use the larger images, just so that they show really nicely through the other stencil. Once I've picked an orientation that I like, I'll tape this stencil down, and I will repeat the stenciling steps as I did before, but this time I'm moving on to a darker color on top of the previous layer. So in the first layer on top, I used Pink Pearl. So now I'll move to Coral Bliss, then Vineyard Berry, then Autumn Blaze, Caramel Toffee, and I'm going to move my image now, and hopefully you can see the effect that I'm getting. I've repositioned my stencil, so now there's just a continuous flow of the stars. So I'll move on to the next darkest layer of green. So I used Green Field, I'll use Shadow Creek. On this next layer for the green area of the watercolor stripes stencil. Then I used Emerald for the blue-green layer, Sapphire for the blue layer, Midnight Violet for the purple layer, and finally Razzleberry for this last red-violet layer. So now I can reveal this layer. Before I remove this, I'm going to do a little bit of ink bleaching. To do this, I'm just adding a little bit of water to my craft mat and a clean water brush. And I'm just adding splatters to this ink just to push the dye ink into my white cardstock. And I like this because it lets me add splatter without taking away from a lot of the white space in this background. This is my finished rainbow background. It's got the drop shadow from the gray ink, a nice array of colors from the watercolor stripe stencil, and also the added double exposure from the Milky Way stencil for the stars. There's obviously a lot to notice and pick up on this background, so I'm going to keep the focal point really simple on this card. So here's my dried background. Like I said, I thought the star motifs were going to work well with the focal element of my card front. So off camera, I used the Splatter Constellations stamp and die set to cut out a little Splatter Aquarius constellation image. I figured by the time this video publishes, it's going to be Aquarius season. But before I assemble this card and stamp the Happy Birthday Aquarius sentiment, I figured it'd be nice to break up the continuity of this background by raising it up a little bit. So I'm going to take the deckled edge die that's in Mix and Match Frames die set and cut this deckled edge out of the center of my striped background. So after using the Mix and Match Frames die set to raise the watercolor stripes panel off of the card, I added the Happy Birthday Aquarius sentiment and the die cut Splatter Aquarius constellation onto my card front and finished this card with essential black and white enamel dots, just the white ones, around my card. So this is just an easy way to add a little bit more interest and tie in your focal point into your stenciled background. To play along with the rainbow happy birthday theme I had in the previous card, I'll continue that motif with this card in creating another really easy and interesting watercolor background. So what I'm going to start with first is the 9x12 watercolor paper pad. And I like to cut the sheets down to quarters, so roughly 6 inches by 4.5 inches. The next thing you'll need is the watercolor pencil, Woodless watercolor pencils. This is a 24 set. And of course, these colors coordinate with your existing Altenew color stash. And just as before, I'm going to pull a rainbow array of colors from this set. So I'll start with Coral Bliss. And what I'm going to do is take a regular pair of scissors and open them so that the blade is exposed. Or one of the knives in the mixed media palette knife set, which is what I'm going to do for this card. And what I'm going to do is scrape this color off of the Woodless watercolor pencil. So Woodless meaning that the entire pencil itself contains the watercolor pigment. So I've got a fine dusting of Coral Bliss on the top left corner of my card. And then I'll just go in order. So I'll pick up Heartbeat. And I'll do the same thing. I'm going to slightly overlap this color on top of Coral Bliss. And of course, the more pigment you apply to your watercolor paper, the more vibrant your end results will be. Then I'll move on to Maple Yellow, then Grass Field. And so if you don't have the Altenew Mixed Media palette set, you could also just use your regular pencil sharpener and keep the shavings in a bowl or something. And then you can use your fingers and almost sprinkle it on top of your watercolor panel. I'm applying a little bit of Mountain Mist, then Turquoise, then finally Lavender Fields, and Rubellite. So I've got that color cascading from top left to bottom right corner. The next thing I'll grab is the Iridescent Altenew ink spray. This ink spray will add a wonderful light layer of shine to this background. Now before I spray this directly onto my watercolor paper, I am going to do a little test spray just to make sure I have the ink flowing. And then pretty high up, I'm going to add this to my background, and you'll see that this will resuspend the Woodless watercolor pigment. So I've added that quite liberally to my background. I'm going to very carefully lift and gently move this pigment on my watercolor panel. And this is why I like to use the larger panels of watercolor cardstock, so that I can cut out the corners that will get really muddy from the colors touching each other a lot, and then you'll get like a mix of brown, for example. And if I feel I need more concentration of color in certain areas, like I've lost a little bit of the red up here, just have to take the pencil again, and while the paper is still wet, just gently scrape a little bit more pigment onto my watercolor paper. So again, I've used the iridescent ink spray to resuspend the Woodless watercolor pencil pigment, and I'll lift it and move it around just to get a really nice mix. Okay, so I like the concentration of color on my background here. Now I can put this back onto my stamping mat and use my heat tool to quickly dry off this watercolor panel. So now that my background is dry, I can go ahead and trim off the excess to an A2 size card front. So that's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So here's my trimmed watercolor background on my folded note card base. And you can see that I got rid of those muddy corners. And to keep this arrangement really simple, I decided to use a really small stamp set. This is the Mini Delight birthday banner. And of course, all Mini Delights come with their coordinating dies. And off camera, I went ahead and made the focal point to this card, which was just this stamped banner in black ink, stamped onto some scrap white cardstock. I double foam mounted the main banner right in the center of my cardstock, and then I adhered the tail end pieces around the center banner. And then I finished this card with a few satin gold sequins around my main sentiment. And that finishes this second really easy background to make, of course in an array of rainbow colors as well. But this looks great in monochrome, and you can go ahead and stamp on top of this for even more interest around your sentiment banners or other sentiment die cuts. This next background technique is still very amorphous and is loosely based on the Japanese Suminagashi type of paper marbling. We can achieve that effect very simply with a little vessel of water here. I've got an old Tupperware container that I used just for crafts, filled with just roughly 1/2 inch of water. For this effect, you'll need either photo paper or the specialty paper, Yupo paper, for alcohol ink techniques, and also your mixture of Altenew Artist Marker refills. For now, I'll keep this monochrome, and I'm using Soft Lilac and Midnight Violet Artist Marker refills. These are the refills from set B of the Altenew Artist Markers. And I've already trimmed down my Yupo paper to 4 1/4 and 5 1/2 inches. And I have a paper towel here to lay this down when I'm done. So, very simply, I'm just going to add just a few drops of the Altenew Artist Marker refills to the surface of my water, and you'll see it immediately disperse on here. I'm going to use a piece of paper that I grabbed from my trash can to add little bits of ink around the surface of my water, as if I'm painting on the water surface, just as what is typically done for Suminagashi. Okay, so I think that's pretty adequate, and all I have to do now, very gently, I'm going to curve it into a U shape, because I don't want this alcohol ink to cover my entire Yupo paper background. I'm just going to press this in, roll it towards me, roll it away from me, and we'll see what comes up on the front of my Yupo paper from this technique. So I'm just going to blot off the excess water to my paper towel here and let this air dry on the surface of my paper towel. So I want a little bit more color intensity on here, so I'm going to do another layer. I've just lightly wiped the surface of the water just to get a little bit of the excess off. And then I'll add a few more drops of the Soft Lilac. Let's see, just for fun, I'm going to add a little bit of Lavender Fields. This is all still from the Set B family of Altenew Artist Marker refills. And I think this is enough purple for my background. I'm going to add in a darker color. So this is still from the Set B family. This is Lava Rock, and it's from the Warm Gray family of inks. And I won't add too much of this. And I don't want to add too much of that because it's really dark. In fact, I might dilute it with more of that soft lilac just to get it to break up a little bit on the surface of my water. And again, my Yupo paper is dry from the water. And I will press this into the surface again. And after adding a few more layers of that ink in different mixes to my water here, I think I've come up with a really interesting and really textural background for my focal piece. Now I will let this fully dry on some paper towels while I work on my focal element. So here's my finished background. It sort of reminds me of terrazzo tiles with the large pieces of alcohol ink dispersed throughout my background. Off camera, I decided to use one of my favorites. This is the Beauty Within stamp, die, and coordinating stencil bundle. However, I'm just going to use the stamp and die set today. I already stamped a panel of white cardstock in permanent black ink. And I also used the coordinating alcohol inks from Set B to color in the flower and leaf image here. So then I'll use the coordinating die set to cut out these images. So on my cutting mat, I've planned for this arrangement. And just so I can adhere the vellum without showing the adhesive, I'm going to adhere these excess flap pieces to the back of my Yupo paper. And now I can adhere my terrazzo type background to my folded note card base. To finish this card, I'm adding white enamel dots. This is the same set as earlier. And that finishes this paper marbling card inspired by the Japanese Suminagashi technique by using your Altenew Artist Marker refills on Yupo paper or photo paper. So again, these are background techniques inspired by things you hopefully already have in your Altenew stash. And these background elements perfectly balance my foreground centerpieces here. My series encourages you to shop your existing Altenew stash and rekindle their love with newer releases. Perfect Pairings with Jaycee airs on the Altenew channel every second and fourth Sunday of the month. Please make sure you like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for tuning in to this perfect pairing episode with me, and I'll see you in the next one.
Hello crafters, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you want to see more, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything. Thanks for watching!